It's great to welcome to the program today Maximillian Alvarez, who's a writer based in Baltimore, a dual PhD candidate in history and comparative literature at the University of Michigan, and also the host of Working People, a podcast by, for, and about the working class today. It's so great to have you on today. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
So let's just jump right in and talk a little bit about, I guess even how to introduce the subject is already sort of part of the issue. Do we want to talk about fascism? Do we want to talk about Antifa? Do we want to talk about protest movements? I don't really know what the right way to frame the conversation is, so maybe I'll let you do it. What do you think is the fundamental sort of crux of what we should be talking about right now regarding the movement against fascism that is often seen through protests in the media?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's the question that we should all be asking, right? Because I think that, one of the biggest constraints to, anti-fascist politics is kind of wading through all the kind of negative portrayals and biases that, we get in the media of anti-fascism, or that we kind of absorb from the environment about what anti-fascism is. And, part of the work that I do and so many others do is try to, really get into kind of the meat and bones of what anti-fascist politics is, and try to kind of get people to understand that, anti-fascism shouldn't be a bad thing, right? Living a life that is expressly non-fascist, right? That is devoted to preventing, fascism or fascist-like politics from ever emerging again. That should be a thing that we should all want. And so, in that regard, I think, what's really important is to kind of understand what the stakes are of preventing fascism or fascist-like politics from growing in this country or beyond this country, and the ways that, everyday working people are more closely aligned with the politics of anti-fascism than I think they realize. But again, we tend to kind of associate anti-fascism as such, with a couple of like repeated media portrayals of certain tactics of certain anti-fascist groups that really miss the larger picture of how the point of anti-fascism, right, is to inoculate our society from kinds of the conditions that lead people to find fascism attractive, right? This is a conversation that, I've been having and that others have been having, since before Donald Trump was elected, right? Because I think, Jeff Ely, who's a professor at the University of Michigan and a specialist in the politics of Nazi Germany, put it really well, when he said that, we get into a lot of discussions about whether or not Donald Trump is fascist, whether or not this or that policy is fascist, this or that group of people is fascist. And that gets us bogged down kind of in, I think a kind of roundabout discussion about whether or not our historical conditions right now in the American present kind of map on, beat by beat to the conditions of, Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, or Italy, with the rise of Mussolini. And, I think it's kind of like a maze without an exit, right? Because history's never going to kind of repeat itself point by point. And I think that Jeff Ely's really instructive here when he says that, history's never going to repeat itself precisely. And so the more important question is not to ask whether or not, this or that person is, fascist by some sort of kind of textbook definition that leads us to believe that there is only like one kind of historical kind of potion for creating fascism, right? The question is like, what sorts of historical conditions lead more and more people, a critical mass of people, to find fascism or fascist-like politics more attractive?
Well,
And I think,
to focus in on what you said about the portrayals in media, so I consider myself most aligned with the political movement called social democracy. And when I look at social democracy, I see an anti-fascist worldview, an anti-fascist ideology. When you look at fascism as, this right wing, often very nationalist authoritarianism, that sometimes has dictatorial power, but not always. Like, as you're talking about, it's not always exactly the same. I can think of no progressive ideology of any kind that wouldn't be strongly against that. And so, what I wanted to kind of pose to you is, when you talk about the media portrayals of people in whatever city who are, doing some violent act or whatever the case may be, have they perverted the anti-fascist movement, or are they, in a sense, I mean, I see a contradiction in the tactics, as you talk about, of some, in that they are very authoritarian tactics claiming to fight against a slightly different form of authoritarianism. So what is the kind of right way to interpret those tactics and the media portrayals thereof?
So can I ask a quick clarifying question
Yeah.
by what you mean in that context by authoritarian tactics?
Well, in my view, if I were to decide that in order to protest some version of authoritarianism, I am going to foist acts of violence upon people who are just existing in society and trying to go about their life, for example, or working a job or whatever the case may be. To me, that seems like an authoritarian tactic which I am engaging in order to fight supposed authoritarianism. And I don't mean supposed in the sense that I don't believe it's there. I do. But what I identify as authoritarianism, I am saying I am going to impose what I see as a solution to authoritarianism with something that is, in a sense, also authoritarian.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I get where you're coming from, and I know that this is a conversation that we kind of get bogged down in, right? Is a lot of folks, when they're talking about anti-fascist politics, they kind of require that in order to even have the conversation, we need to kind of condemn certain tactics as violent and counterproductive, and I 100% get where you're coming from in terms of the optics of these sorts of tactics, and how much they sync up with a broader movement, a more popularized movement of everyday anti-fascism. And I think the when we're asked to kind of condemn certain violent tactics like black bloc tactics, I mean, black bloc itself is not even like an expressly and necessarily violent tactic. A lot of it is based on kind of community defense. I mean, if you look at like the J20 trials, you can see exactly why people wear masks, because the government tried to kind of in an almost unprecedented way charge over 300 people with kind of conspiracy to riot just because they were wearing the same thing. And that's because they couldn't pick out any single one person because of the masks. And that's part of the kind of protective tactic. But to the point that you're asking about, if, and that someone punches Richard Spencer, or if like a Bank of America window gets broken, and that this, as you said, is the optics of this are kind of protesters foisting, I think you said, like a certain, what looks like an authoritarian tactic onto, a presumably neutral kind of world or neutral people. I think that that's why it's so important to kind of understand what the stakes of anti-fascism are, because I think what anti-fascism argues is that this sort of framing of the question kind of presumes a certain state of normal nonviolence that we live in every day, or that we aren't endorsing certain forms of violence already, and that these tactics are not in any way expression of frustration and desperation against the pre-existing forms of violence that exist in our society.
Well, we
Right. And I think that,
maybe so let me jump in there. Maybe we may just disagree as to what tactics are acceptable, which would be fine. I mean, that's a reasonable disagreement to have. But I guess in order to figure that out, I mean, I don't disagree that, for example, the financial system status quo that we have in the United States confers or includes a type of violence against, the average person who has either a student loan or ends up needing payday loans, or, overdrafts endlessly because they already don't have money, so the bank then is charging. I get that there is a form of violence in that, but I guess in order to inform our audience who may not be familiar with you, Would that type of violence be countered with something like punching someone in the face? Do you see them as equivalent in some way? Or you did mention some unproductive tactics. Maybe I'm wondering which ones you meant by that. We may just have a different list, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I think, and I appreciate, the framing of the question because I think this is a productive way to discuss things. I mean, I would say first and foremost, I do not see myself in any position to kind of judge the tactics of people that I'm not organizing with, right? I've been in situations where people have done things that I think are endangering the bulk of us, and we will hash that out internally. Like if people, are provoking police from the outside while a group of us are kind of face to face with the police, it is not tactically sound, right, to kind of goad police into arresting us when, we could possibly avoid that. But at the same time, like I said, like, I do not feel like I have any place to judge kind of the expressions of frustration and desperation that people feel when, as you said, we live in such a kind of perpetual state of everyday violence that the politics of fascism kind of exacerbates and accentuates, like as we creep further into it. And, that's I think what my biggest problem is with kind of the framing of the violence question, right? Because while I think many average people, are again expressly committed to not wanting fascism in this country, I think that their knee-jerk kind of revulsion to kind of seeing someone get punched or a window getting broken, I think it comes from a good place. But what I would ask people to consider is that, how that question of condemning violence from protesters in the same way that we are asked to condemn the violence of black protesters after, Darren Wilson kills, a young black kid, like near St. Louis or here in Baltimore where I am, we're asking ourselves not to see context, right? We're asking ourselves to pretend that it's not incredibly weird and bad that we only ever seem to apply the term violence to the powerless.
Well, I mean,
So
okay, so I guess it depends on who we're talking about. I think that there are plenty of people who have a more nuanced view, which is there are actually multiple types of violence, and one may recognize that and not believe that, for example, punching someone is morally equivalent to a form of violence, for example, from a financial institution. But because you're right that it is really, I'm not. You said you don't want to judge necessarily, and you talk about the revulsion. I mean, I am a very pragmatic thinker, maybe to a fault. When I think of the pragmatic effect of some of these tactics, given that I share the goal of being against fascism, that's where a lot of my concern comes from, where I wonder what is the end game and how might some of those tactics ultimately achieve the change that I want. I don't see it. And that's why without having to ask, I have not ever been asked to denounce this, that, or the other thing, other than once Richard Spencer asked me if I denounce Pol Pot. And I said, yes, I do. That's an easy one. But that's a story for another day. I've said I don't endorse these tactics because I fundamentally, aside from my moral assessment, don't think that they will achieve the change that I want. And maybe the pragmatics are more easy to discuss than the morality.
hmm I think, yeah, so that I definitely understand more, right? Because yeah, I think to your point that if we get bogged down in a moral discussion about violence and pacifism, right? Like we were saying before, you end up getting, backing yourself into kind of a logical corner where you are blinding yourself to all the existing forms of violence that kind of produce this sort of political outrage, political desperation, and people feeling the need to defend their communities using whatever tactics they have available to them, especially when the state itself is not listening to them. Martin Luther King famously said that riots are the voice of the unheard, right? And I think that is another ingredient to the question of, how close we are to fascism, fascist-like politics, is when people lose faith in, government having any sort of ability to kind of address these issues. They need to turn to community defense. And then I think we get into the real tissue of the question that you asked. Okay, like if this is what we're up against, then how tactically sound, is it to go in this or that direction? And here is where I think, again, the politics of everyday anti-fascism is so crucial, right? Because, we live in a sensationalist, kind of media environment. It's just kind of the world that we live in. And naturally, the clip of Richard Spencer getting punched is the thing that just gets way more play than all the rest of, like anti-fascist politics that occurs, and to their credit, there are groups across the United States, whether it's like Pop Mob in Portland, even like DSA, like Rose City Antifa. There's so many groups that are doing anti-fascism in ways that tactically I think are more aligned with what you're asking. Because again, the goal is to inoculate our society from fascism taking root. And the way that you do that, right, is to build community, to build solidarity, to protect one another, to find joy in your community in ways that kind of prevent lonely, desperate, angry people from latching themselves on to a reactionary, vicious, violent, jingoistic and ethno-nationalist point of view.
I just don't see some of the tactics that I've seen employed achieving that. In other words, I think that they generate more unrest and fear and all of the. I mean, listen, here's where I think I'm struggling with I would never. I don't believe in universal disarmament, and I would never sort of preemptively suggest, here's the list of things that no matter how bad it gets, no one should or will ever do. I think that is a problem, as you're pointing out. However, when half the country doesn't vote, I mean, okay, a lot of people say voting doesn't really matter because the system is set up to make it so that it doesn't really matter. We've not tried it. Half the country doesn't vote. Every recent election at certainly the national level, if not state level, and even at more local levels, if we had full voter engagement, we would have a drastically different situation right now. There's a whole list of other tactics I've talked about, including mass rallies at urban centers, strategic loan defaults, which would cripple the finance. There's this whole long list of stuff that's never been done that doesn't go to physical violence. So I'm not ready to say we're at the point where those are the tactics that would be the next ones on my list. And of course, people can disagree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I wrote this article for the Baffler last year called Anti-Fascism and the Left's Fear of Power, where we were talking about different tactics, but I think it overlaps somewhat with the discussion that we're having here, right? Because again, I get where you're coming from, and I think that from a tactical discussion, we can have a more productive back and forth than, if we get bogged down in a moral discussion about absolute pacifism. And, this was a criticism that we faced, in the Stop Spencer Coalition when we were mobilizing against Richard Spencer's impending appearance at Michigan State and the University of Michigan. We got a lot of pushback, including from people on the left who said, this is not tactically sound. It is going to turn people against you. Just ignore, Richard Spencer and the KKK members and all the white nationalists who were surrounding our community, who we knew were going to be there, and who we knew were going to use this opportunity to occupy our community and instill fear in the people that are most vulnerable in our communities. And I think that just like we were talking about kind of the presumption of violence only existing when, people kind of lash out after sustaining just years and years and years of oppressive violence from the state, from the economy, let alone from, structures of racism, misogyny, homophobia, so on and so forth, right? Just in that sort of way, the presumption that that we are not already kind of backsliding on, like a kind of political hill, I think is tactically unsound. I think that, for those who were criticizing us for saying that this was only going to give like the right more ammunition to kind of police dissent on campus communities. My response was like, do you think they're not doing that already? Like they've been
Yeah, they
doing
are doing
this.
that already. I guess I might approach it from a slightly more macro perspective, which is when I think about the big advancements of the last 120 years, and I may just have the history wrong on this, and we would sort that out. It seems as though they have been linked to a particular type of activism that did not rely on these tactics. So when I think about like the New Deal of the post World War II era, when I think about Martin Luther King, who you mentioned, when I think about some of the significant, I mean, it's not enough, but in the context, significant regulatory advancements of the late 80s and early 90s, when I think about that stuff, it seems that although we may all agree it's not enough, that those are pretty significant advancements that we can point to that came primarily on the back of not what we would call I'm distinguishing non-physically violent activism. Am I just wrong about the history?
No, I think you're right, but I think again, like I was saying with my problem with the question about like condemning violence is that it's asking us to ignore context. I think that we all, I mean, this is just the way that we look at history, right? It's impossible to kind of know everything that was going on at the time. And so, through history books and narratives, right, we get a more distilled version of what happened. And I think that putting these, great and important nonviolent movements in context is really important, right? Because, for Martin Luther King and many factions of the civil rights movement, nonviolence was a very important tactic to maintain. But it was also taking place within the context of increasing militancy from other, factions of the civil rights and kind of, black liberatory movement, right? That was also informing the decisions of people in power, right? Just the March on Washington would not have scared, the white establishment as much if they were not also, like thinking about, like armed, black citizens kind of like protecting their communities, right? Or if they hadn't seen, what responses communities are kind of left with when, they feel like there's nowhere to turn and they're facing violence from the state every day. And so I think that history is messy and there are always kind of more complicated contexts than we give it credit for.
Well, it seems like we definitely are on the same page in terms of a lot of the context. It does seem like the fundamental area of disagreement is not maybe both to some degree, the practicality and also the morality of some particular tactics. But I really appreciate that we were able to discuss it in this way. We've been speaking with Maximillian Alvarez, who's a writer based in Baltimore, dual PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, and also host of Working People, a podcast by, for, and about the working class today. Really appreciate your time and hope to be able to speak again in the future.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate it.